are really pleased to have the opportunity to organize this session for many countries to be joining from around the region. We have, I think, over 80 participants who've registered for this webinar, and we're just delighted to have the time to talk. My name is Melissa Alvarado. I manage UN Women's regional Ending Violence Against Women portfolio, and we are very busy organizing a series of webinars with our colleagues Lee Ashley Lipscomb and Pamela Maria Godoy, who are the regional emergency gender-based violence advisors. They work in an interagency capacity, so they're technically sitting with UNFPA, but their role is to work across a range of agencies to support a whole community of actors that are addressing gender-based violence in emergencies. So now that we are all immersed in emergency context, we are having a lot more conversations about how do we address gender-based violence in an emergency settings. And so we've been organizing these webinars with development actors, people who perhaps don't normally engage in humanitarian or emergency response, so that we can all get a better understanding of some of the language, some of the techniques, some of the tools and approaches that have been developed over many years of learning and experience and evidence collection that really shape, what we are doing now in terms of responding to and preventing gender-based violence in the context of emergencies. So the really good work that colleagues have been doing for decades is really now coming to the forefront and giving us all an advantage, allowing us to leap forward with our learning and to have the opportunity to really put those good tools, techniques, and guidance to work. I see that many of you are adding in a good morning, a hello to colleagues. Please continue to do that because we have such a large group. We will not be going around and doing individual introductions. So we definitely would love to hear from you. Tell us who you are, where you're working. We encourage you to do that, and we encourage everyone to know who's online. And as we go through this session, we will have a presentation. We'll go through a PowerPoint presentation by Lee Ashley and Pamela. We will be pausing for remarks and comments and questions, and we encourage you to use the chat to put in a question or comment whenever you have the urge to do so. I want to acknowledge that this is, as I said before, one in a series of sessions that we've organized related to GBV and emergencies. We've done a session that's really just the basics. Pamela and Lee Ashley will give us a bit of background related to the website that you're seeing on the screen in front of you right now, the GBV Area of Responsibility. We call it the GBVAoR for short. That has a wealth of information. I invite all of you to use that resource and to unearth all of the great resources that are there. One of the reasons that we organized this session today is because UN Women, we did a quick rapid assessment of CSOs in our region to understand how they were affected by COVID, how they were being able to continue support to women affected by violence during COVID. And one of the points of feedback that we got from them was that they were interested in knowing more about technology-based solutions, resources, approaches, guidance, and there's some great resources and guidance available right now on this. It's something that is also still in development. It's a very active space for learning. I feel like we are all very much learning right now. Welcome to this journey. We're really on a journey together. So I'm gonna turn it over to Lee Ashley and Pamela and invite you to begin the presentation and the sessions, and then we will look forward to a session and moments where we can talk and discuss as we go through and at the end as well. So welcome, Lee Ashley and Pamela. Thank you for being with us today.
Thank you so much, Melissa, and the whole team who supported us in coordinating this webinar today. I'm Very happy to see a few familiar faces from last week back here again and to meet new colleagues today. My name is Lee Ashley and my teammate Pamela and I will be with you. Just a few quick housekeeping issues. If you could please make sure your mics are on mute and turn off cameras, and that will help us all maximize our bandwidth and have a speedy connected webinar together. Please write your questions in the chat room. We are monitoring the chat room and we will address the questions at specific times during the presentation, as well as we have ample time at the end for question and answers. The recording and materials from the webinar will be provided afterwards. The UN Women team will be supporting us and making sure that all the resources we discussed today are provided to you. So with that, I think I'll just start on the next slide, please, to introduce ourselves a little bit more and why we are here. Pamela and I represent the GBVAoR. Thank you for the introduction, Melissa. The GBVAoR is the global interagency coordination mechanism for GBV interventions in emergencies. And as Melissa mentioned, we're an interagency resource and we're available to partners who are working to provide both prevention and response to GBV in emergency context. And we work at the strategic partnership or macro policy level, as well as our primary focus group, our coordination mechanisms at the field level. So we're very excited to be here with you today. I will now hand over to Pamela to introduce herself.
Hello, good morning, everyone. It's great to see the previous participants from last week and to welcome new ones. Especially we have participants coming from the academe, as well as those working on migrant workers' concerns. So I'm Pamela Marie Godoy, Regional Emergency GBV Coordination Specialist. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Pamela. So let's get started. In the context of remote service delivery, we just wanted to review some of the coordination mechanisms that may be available. And at the end of last week's webinar, we had a brief discussion on ways that we're adapting to work across the nexus to respond to GBV in the COVID pandemic. And we talked a little bit about how individual programs or organizations are responding. But today we thought that we'd try to pick up from there and provide more information about how you as GBV actors can connect with others at country level. Next slide, please. So coordination mechanisms can help you find like-minded counterparts in the humanitarian system, and that is very important to be able to work together to strategize and plan the response to GBV, particularly in this COVID-19 context. So many of you are probably familiar with the UN country team structures. But this diagram provides you an overview of what a humanitarian coordination system looks like. And the humanitarian coordination system operates with this structure led by the UN, with GBV as part of the protection cluster. And GBV is also integrated into other sectors of response, such as water, sanitation and hygiene, nutrition, health, any of the sectors. This is what we might call the classic model, but in many countries, especially in the Asia Pacific, governments have adopted this model and adapted it so that natural disaster authorities or other entities coordinate using the same model with sectors or clusters led by government, and often that is supported by technical support from UN agencies or civil society agencies such as Red Cross, National Red Cross organizations. So I see we have Bangladesh, Philippines, Indonesia on the line today. Those national coordination structures are examples of this, where it's a similar model to the UN, but been adapted for the leadership of the national government. Next slide, please. So here is a list of some countries that have active GBV coordination mechanisms. And I have to apologize because I just realized that Myanmar is not listed. So before we send you this presentation today, we will add Myanmar to the list. But in all of these contexts, we do have coordination mechanisms that meet regularly and talk specifically about how to provide GBV services in emergencies. So I encourage all of you to please reach out and connect with these groups if you have not already done so, especially if you're a frontline service provider, because there's valuable information that you can exchange in these meetings and with these different actors that will enhance the COVID-19 response, and really across both the development and the humanitarian spheres. Next slide, please. So I wanted to highlight kind of 5 ways that you can benefit and that we can benefit, both development and humanitarian actors working together. So first, sharing information saves time for all of us and increases our effectiveness. So for example, if we share information on the programming we're doing for COVID, this might allow us to avoid duplication, and we can share our lessons learned like we're doing today and improve the quality of our response. It's also essential to share information about funding so that in one country you can maximize both the humanitarian and the development envelopes and resources that are available. And finally, it's a way to ensure that there's minimum standards and quality of service available, regardless if it's a humanitarian or development response, but a survivor would have a minimum quality of service regardless of where she or he may enter into a service delivery point. So second, an area of collaboration, and third can be advocacy and prevention. So for example, efforts to address key issues such as child marriage and intimate partner violence will be more effective when we work together. GBV does not comply with structural boundaries and these models that we make for ourselves. It crosses borders. So I think that we really must be united across the humanitarian development and peace building spheres in our approach to combat these issues, both in prevention programming as well as our advocacy efforts. So fourth, preparedness. In the development world, you may be working more on disaster risk reduction, whereas humanitarians may be more involved in contingency planning. And it's really important that we align our methods and our planning, and that way we can address and be ready faster together to respond. And last, joint capacity building initiatives such as this one are really critical, and it allows actors to be adaptable and flexible to respond to the reality of emergencies. Because again, the reality is not that there's a line drawn in the sand, but in fact, our worlds merge as development and humanitarian actors. And development actors need to have humanitarian skills to upscale in an emergency such as this one. And the humanitarian actors need to have skills to be able to transition to development spheres and to ensure a sustainable response. So that's my sales pitch about how and why we should work together. I'd really encourage you to please go to the GBVAoR website at gbvaor.net. This information comes from the Coordination of GBV in Emergencies Handbook. And the page numbers are there for you, but there are a lot of resources that may be helpful to you if you're new to the humanitarian coordination system. And for those of you who are not new, there are a lot of resources to help us understand how to work better across the nexus. Okay, next slide, please. And I'm going to hand over to Pamela for an interactive exercise.
Thank you, Lee Ashley. So at this point, we would like to invite our participants to a brief interactive activity. So again, welcome to everyone who's participating. So in the COVID-19 crisis that we are faced on, We invite you to imagine a GBV survivor who needs to reach the nearest health facility for treatment of injuries. Given the COVID-19 crisis and how your particular country duty station is responding to the crisis, identify the specific obstacles or hindrances that she will likely encounter if she wants to reach the nearest health facility for treatment of injuries. You can type your answers in the chat box. Okay, thank you, Harry, for responding. How about the other participants? Okay, mobility restrictions, curfews, total lockdown, yes. Lack of medical personnel, perhaps because they are all focused on COVID-19 crisis. Okay, and then camp restrictions. Yes, that's true. Lack of knowledge about available services. Phones are confiscated by employers. No access to Wi-Fi. And then within the home, there are challenges and restrictions. Specific concerns if they are undocumented. And then lack in some places, specifically for migrants, domestic workers. And then specific vulnerabilities for persons with disabilities. Some, they don't even know the contact numbers. Okay, closures of essential services. Okay. Oh, that's not so good to hear that GBV is not a priority to the health service provider. Prof. De Jos, women may have children who cannot be left behind. That's very true. Lack of protection support services. Rural areas, definitely mostly inaccessible. Okay. So, Carly, next slide, please. Thank you so much for all your inputs. We're capturing this in the chat messages. So before we move on, we just want to reiterate something that we also highlighted last week, that we operate from the understanding and recognition that gender-based violence is taking place. We recognize that even in normal times, GBV survivors face barriers in accessing services for a variety of reasons, such as you have mentioned, lack of awareness of available services. It can be stigma by family and community members, fear of further violence from perpetrators, and dismissive attitudes from service providers. Thus, we all know that gender-based violence is vastly underreported. So we assume as humanitarian workers that GBV is taking place. Waiting for or seeking population-based data on the true magnitude of GBV should not be a priority in an emergency, and in this case, the COVID-19 response, due to safety and ethical challenges in collecting such data. Next slide, please. And then next slide. Okay, so if not in all contexts, a GBV referral pathway already exists, but depending on the country level strategies that are being implemented to contain the spread of the coronavirus disease, such as what you have mentioned earlier, such as mobility restrictions, partial or complete lockdown, shelter in place or stay at home orders, there needs to be a review on whether existing services prior to the COVID-19 pandemic are still operational. Will they continue to function, or will they temporarily close? What services can shift from face-to-face to remote service modality, and what new services can be made available? Next slide, please. Remote GBV service delivery provides GBV services, predominantly emotional support and case management over a technology platform. It can be a hotline, a chat, or SMS rather than in person. There is an existing guidelines for remote GBV service delivery from IRC. Remote GBV service delivery expands access to crisis support and case management in contexts that are inaccessible or unserved, as well as to populations who cannot reach in-person services due to restricted mobility, such as what we are seeing right now. It offers greater confidentiality for all survivors, but it may also be particularly useful in reaching survivors who face additional stigma related to help seeking, such as LGBTI survivors or male survivors. So given the scenarios that you have outlined in the interactive activity, in this particular COVID-19 crisis, there are particularly two scenarios wherein remote GBV case management may be needed. The first one is when there are no dedicated and confidential places wherein the caseworker can meet with the survivor. And the second scenario is even if a space is available for the caseworker, the survivor is not physically able to meet the caseworker due to the restrictions of movement. Next slide, please. And the next slide. So we're in development context, there is an existing guidance on hotlines or helplines for GBV survivors. For instance, we have the Essential Services Package for Women and Girls Subject to Violence, which is a guidance tool identifying the essential services to be provided to survivors by the health, social services, police, and justice sectors. A helpline is considered as an essential service under social services, which is Module 4. Helplines offer anonymity, allowing survivors to access help and information quickly in confidence so that they won't suffer harassment or stigmatization for reporting an incident. Next slide, please. Based on the Essential Services Package, helplines should be made available and accessible. Availability means that helplines are free of charge, preferably operating 24/7 with trained staff and with linkages to other services or sectors. Accessibility refers to ensuring that information about the helpline is clearly disseminated in platforms where women and girls may best access information, linguistically accessible, and in multiple formats, especially for persons with disabilities. Next slide, please. So these are some of the considerations when we want to shift and when we need to shift from static to remote GBV case management in the context of COVID. Caseworkers need to undergo a proper orientation on how to provide remote GBV case management. Giving the caseworkers the written protocol is definitely helpful, but not sufficient. Provide them with a session to discuss the modalities of the remote case management and how this differ from the in-person case management, wherein they follow the standard GBV case management process, while for remote, they have to do crisis management adaptation. Allow them to ask questions or discuss concerns with you. Check if the caseworker is living or working from a place where there is phone signal or mobile phone signal. Check if the caseworker is able to ensure confidentiality when providing remote GBV case management. If the caseworker is working from home, does she live with other family members? If so, does she have a room or a space in her home or a nearby area where she can be alone and talk with survivors and guarantee confidentiality? Make sure to procure mobile phones for the caseworker or at least a dedicated SIM card and the needed credit to call survivors, other service providers, the supervisor, or other colleagues as needed. Remember that caseworkers should not be using their personal phone number to provide case management. Ensure the needed supervision and staff care for the caseworkers working from home. Consider the number of cases that a caseworker can handle. If she's working from home and she's also taking care of children or other family members, she may not be able to manage the usual number of cases. And as we have said earlier, caseworkers should have the latest GBV referral pathway. Remember, without confidentiality, remote GBV case management cannot be provided. Next slide, please. The first stage of all GBV case management are concerned with making introductions of the caseworker, her organization, and gaining informed consent. In a remote situation, this process will have to be much shorter, as survivors may have very limited time to speak or be in immediate danger. The caseworker would essentially ask the survivor, "Can you tell me your most important concern today?" For assessment, the primary focus is assessing safety and immediate needs, providing referrals to services that are operational, and giving the survivor emotional support and information to keep safe. Please note that majority of the calls may be from survivors who can only call once. It is therefore not recommended to keep notes and case files of these calls unless the caseworkers are continuing an ongoing support to survivors coming from their face-to-face services. Caseworkers will also have to accept that they would have limited opportunities to follow up due to the restrictions of movement, which will narrow the services that they can offer to support the survivors. Next slide, please. We emphasize the need to make referrals with the informed consent of the survivor, provide resources, it can be material support, contacts of other providers as applicable, and encourage her to stay in touch if at all possible. Share key messages or healing statements about the violence is not the fault of the survivor, she's not alone with her journey, and affirm, validate survivors' feelings. For the last few minutes, the caseworker has to stabilize the survivor so she is not leaving the session in a more traumatized state. Encourage a sense of self-determination to help restore a survivor's sense of control and autonomy, even in highly restricted circumstances. The caseworker needs to remind survivors to delete all signs of the call from their phone. If it's an online chat version, the service should be set up so that as soon as the conversation or the chat ends, the chat history is erased. Next slide, please. Ensure that frontline staff and volunteers are trained on psychological first aid and how to relay information on available GBV services. Our go-to reference is the GBV Pocket Guide, which is available in PDF format, and as a smartphone application. You can actually download the interactive Pocket Guide either through App Store or Google Play. So we invite you to do that after the webinar. I now turn you over to Lee Ashley.
Thank you so much, Pamela. So if we could just go to the next slide, please. So for this section of the webinar, we'd like to talk through some examples of the different types of entry points for remote referrals and service delivery. It's important to understand that there are different types of hotlines and remote entry points, some of which are specialized for GBV service delivery, which Pamela has just discussed, but there could be other entry points for referral that are also remote platforms. So hotlines or applications will not always directly provide GBV services, because to provide services, there must be trained staff and minimum standards met for those services. So on this slide, I've just highlighted three main types of remote service or remote entry point platforms. The first is general service or health hotlines. And this may be one of the easiest platforms for a survivor to access. So survivors may call a general hotline because calling a health hotline is not necessarily stigmatizing. Or survivors may call to access help for health injuries and impacts of GBV rather than to specifically seek help for GBV and the broader implications of it. So in this case, general service or health line operators need to know how to manage a disclosure of GBV and know how to safely refer a survivor to the services in the referral pathway and their area. This is particularly important because they need to have standards in place that include GBV guiding principles for these hotlines, even though they're not GBV specific hotlines. Just as one example, a woman may call a health hotline and she's not alone, or her phone may be shared with a partner or a family member. So it's important that even non-specialist hotlines have some training or familiarity with how to refer for GBV services. The second key type of hotline that is relevant for our response are those that target specific groups of persons at high risk of experiencing GBV. The example I've shown here is a hotline for migrant workers in India. GBV may be one of many issues that these hotline operators manage, so it's important that they be trained on how to refer a case safely. I think this is a particularly interesting example because social workers are integrated into this hotline directly. For GBV actors like ourselves, the first question I would have when I see this poster is if the social workers are trained on how to do GBV case management, or at a minimum, how to refer using the local GBV referral pathway. Other similar specialist hotlines might be hotlines for persons with disabilities. I've seen one example in Australia that's set up specifically for COVID-19 and disability, or hotlines for LGBTI communities. And I've also seen hotlines specifically for men as a prevention mechanism for GBV. For the last example, we have a specialized violence against women, or GBV hotline. In this case, a specialized hotline would need to meet the standards and criteria that Pamela presented. And that would mean that they are able to do GBV case management, or at least refer directly to trained social workers or others who could do the case management. Okay, next slide, please. How do you know what hotlines are operating in your context, especially because we know many may be in flux in the COVID situation? And how do you know which are available and trained to receive GBV services? So here I have an example of how linking to the GBV coordination mechanism in your country is important. So the GBV cluster in Bangladesh has recently done a service mapping of all the different types of hotlines to determine which have GBV relevant services, and to make sure that the available and accessible to different actors across different agencies for referrals. And this again shows that in one context, you may have general service hotlines such as disaster warning or humanitarian response. You may have very specific violence against women hotlines, and then you may have hotlines that can provide a specific type of service, such as a mental health support hotline. So if you're exploring shifting to a remote case management modality, or you want to connect with others in your context to learn what they're doing and what's working and what's not working, please do check with your coordination groups and ask for this type of mapping to understand what's available in your area. And if there's not yet a mapping in your area, and I saw one question about what happens if there's not a coordination group, we have at the GBVAoR website a template on how to do a mapping such as this one. So I do encourage you to visit the site, and the template is available if you'd like more guidance on how to do that. Next slide, please. So I wanted to finish this section by just highlighting a few practical examples of how hotlines and remote services have worked both in emergency and development contexts. The first example is what I'd call pure humanitarian from Iraq, and humanitarians worked with the government to establish a free general service hotline. in all of the areas where there are internally displaced persons. And this was general service. It included both male and female hotline operators. The GBV subcluster then went to the hotline and trained all the operators on the referral pathways for the particular geographic regions where they were working and how to safely refer GBV cases. They did advanced training for specific managers on the hotlines and made sure that there were women managers available who could, at the request of a caller, be available to speak to a person of the gender of their choice. And this was quite successful and has actually, there are plans to expand it so development areas can also utilize this hotline if they're impacted or need information about humanitarian services. Next slide, please. Our second case study is from Pakistan, and many of you may be familiar with this, perhaps even working with this particular service. So a women's rights organization has a website, Madagar, and the website link is there at the bottom. And a survivor may go directly to the website and simply read it and be able to take down information to use later. There are hotline numbers listed, including multilingual hotline numbers, or they can simply type in and fill an online form and indicate when or where would be a good time for a caseworker to contact them later. And this can be very useful, again, if you're in a situation where a person has limited access for internet, they may need to be contacted at another time that's safe for them. And I really like this website because it puts the power and the choices with the survivor to decide how she or he may want to be contacted when, and really provides various options for information. The next slide, the next case study is from the GBV phone hotline in Myanmar, which was one of the key case studies used and evaluated to develop the International Rescue Committee's guidelines on remote and mobile service delivery. So it's an NGO-run hotline, originally developed as a humanitarian response for internally displaced people in northern Shan State. But it has evolved over time so that, again, it can receive calls and provide case management services to a broader community working in the development context. So townships, anyone in that area may be able to contact and be put directly in touch with a GBV case manager. Next slide, please. The last example I have is COVID specific, where in Fiji, there's been an upscaling of the phone hotline. I saw we have someone from UNDP in our audience today. This is a UNDP project along with EU, and they reinforced a pre-existing hotline run by a women-led organization that does GBV and child protection case management. And they've also ensured that that hotline can provide general information about safeguarding and health response to COVID-19. So it's integrating COVID-19 health awareness information, GBV referrals, and case management. Next slide, please. So now is the time where we'd like to turn over to you, because as Melissa mentioned, we're all learning together. It's a collaborative process. So we'd really like to hear from you about what your experiences are. And I believe that Carly had sent out 3 questions before this webinar that I hope some of you are prepared to show and tell us about what applications or experiences you're having with hotlines in your context. We're interested in what challenges you're experiencing and also how widely people use those applications. So Carly's just put in the questions into the chat room. I'll repeat them again. First, if there's someone who's willing, please introduce a GBV related app or share your experience working with a hotline in your context. Second, do people widely use the application? Why or why not? And third, what are the challenges using this remote format for GBV service delivery? And we're particularly interested in the challenges which Pamela highlighted in the earlier section. How do we guarantee safety, respect for survivors' choices, confidentiality, and informed consent when we're using remote platforms? So now I'm handing over to the floor. If you would like to raise your hand or indicate in the chat room if you're available to show and tell. Great. So let's start with you. I apologize if I pronounce it incorrectly. Is it Lakwan Mawia? Could you please start us off by sharing your experience?
So, hello?
Yes, go ahead.
The connection here is a little bit bad.
We can hear you. Please go ahead.
Okay, so we have a very terrible case on the other day that a young girl who is around 18 years old.
So maybe we won't, sorry to interrupt you, we won't be sharing specific case examples, but if you could summarize the problem without sharing the specific case examples, that would be great. Thank you so much.
Okay, so for question number 2, do people widely use application service? Why or why not? So I'd like to answer that we don't widely use the application service here in Myanmar in some remote villages. So we still need to meet the survivors. It is pretty difficult for us to do, but sometimes we cannot avoid their requests. We don't know how to go forward to use application service or GBVAoR widely in our community.
Thank you. That's really helpful. So if I understand correctly, so because they're remote areas, you can provide information perhaps using an application, but if the services aren't available, the question is, what do you do?
So we have poor internet connection in remote villages.
Mm-hmm.
And when the survival needs to help, then we cannot provide this kind of telephone talking or online talking, whatever. So according to their request, we still need to go to the survivor's place. That is pretty bad, but we cannot avoid. In the other date, a young lady is in prison in Kalemio because of he killed his uncle because her uncle raped her for several times. So she finally can't stand more. So she chopped with an axe at nighttime.
Okay. So
in this case, we still go to the prison. So we cannot use, application service and something like that. It is pretty difficult situation.
Okay, thank you. It sounds like you're really dealing with some incredible challenges there. And you're not alone.
Right.
Last week we had a
Right.
webinar where we heard from many service providers. It's good to talk about remote, but many of our clients are in areas where there is no phone access or
Right.
no internet. So in that case, there are ways that you could think about strategizing how to integrate the GBV services into the health services or into other essential services that are going to the different areas. We mentioned earlier the resource on remote and mobile service delivery from International Rescue Committee. And I would recommend looking at that because it was developed in part to deal with rural areas, and they send mobile teams. So you mentioned that you still may need to go physically to places. So It's really about seeing then how you can use mobile teams. And in COVID context, we know that's even more limited in access. So it may be integrating into mobile COVID response teams. So this may be one area. And then, as you mentioned, prison monitoring, or monitoring of other spaces where you feel there are high risks of GBV could be an area that GBV actors could work using some of the standard modalities such as safety audits, where you could make sure that you're identifying risks before they happen in key areas like that. And then also making sure that you have the referral information that you can respond. If you only have 10 minutes with someone who needs help, you have that referral information with you at all times. I carry it in my back pocket when I'm in the field. So that way you can link them even, you know, using something that's available in the field at that time. And we're happy if you want to follow up after this call to provide our information, provide our contact information if you want to discuss case specifics and get advice. We do ask that we don't discuss case specifics on a call, just to make sure that we maintain our confidentiality because they're recorded, and also that we know that sometimes Zoom links have been infiltrated. So please bear with me. We do really care about the issues that you're raising, but we're asking everyone to try to keep it to the outline of the issue rather than the specifics. Okay, thank you. Could we hear from some of the others in the chat? Who would like to share their experience working with a hotline or a specific application?
Ashley from BNSK, Sumaiya.
Yes, please go ahead, BNSK.
Hello. Thank you. Hello. Yes, thank you so much for arranging this good session. I'd like to share our experience, this COVID-19.
Yeah, can you come closer to the where your mic or audio is?
Sure.
We can hear you better. Thank you.
Yeah. Now, can you hear me now better?
A bit louder, perhaps.
Okay. Sad, can you help? Sad, can you help me? The sound off. Okay. I'm coming to closer. Now, do you hear me? Hello. Is it okay? Sorry.
Yes, please go ahead.
Okay. This is our experience. We have just finished our study on migrant workers, what type of gender-based violation they are facing in our domestic workers and overseas migrant workers also. We have a free specific hotline. Through that, we are receiving phone call. And we have more than 20 cases from overseas migrant workers, Lebanon, Jordan, Saudi Arabia. I will share with this UN Bangladesh office. And what they are facing, they are torturing by the family members, but they cannot go outside. They are calling us. We are sometimes referring to the civil society organization in there, but there is just curfew. Some places we have a lockdown, and even in Bangladesh there is some services, but their office all are closed. Even in the medical service near our office, there is some government medical service also, but they are all concerned on coronavirus. So at this moment, our women are suffering a lot. Even their children. They cannot go to doctor, they cannot take support service, they don't have money, what the day labor, what the domestic workers all lose their jobs. So this is a really difficult situation. From BNSK, we're supporting day meal, some food service, but this is not enough. This is a problem is creating day to day more because they cannot go outside. They don't have work also. And even there is no psychological support. So I don't know. I don't know means how we will tackle huge problem. This is our concern. Thank you.
So thank you so much for, really highlighting to us how challenging the situation is and how great the need and demand for GBV services are. So earlier on a slide, I shared the GBV cluster list of hotlines. Many of those are operational. They've been checking them. So I would encourage to link with those actors at the GBV cluster if you haven't been able to yet.
Just I'd like to add one more thing. Don't mind, please.
Yes.
Because I will request even women, because you have the office in all over world. So if it is possible, support more migrant women workers, especially the daily laborers. From Bangladesh office, we received day meal, hot meal for the workers. The woman was very happy because when they are in trauma and tortured, they don't have food in the house. When they got the ready-made meal, that is really helpful. It cannot imagine. I can send some photo and their experience also. So I will request UN Women regional office how they can support all over the world, because everybody is suffering, especially from the Asia, South Asia, women. This is our request from BNSK. Support all organizations, support all women. This is really, really crucial time for women and children.
Thank you. That's excellent. And in addition to UN Women, I would reach out to that coordination group because some of the issues you're raising, such as ensuring migrant women receive food and are included in the distribution of humanitarian assistance across all the sectors, you'll really be able to work together with those actors and push that advocacy point. Because as you point out, it's a critical group that we need to address their concerns. And I believe our webinar next week will be looking more specifically at migrant workers. So we'd like to hear from you again and learn more about the experiences that you're having and how we can address those challenges.
And
so
sorry, more 1 minute. We have done one research. I will share, I hope next week I can share this research findings with you.
Please do, thank you. That would be excellent.
Migrant workers, thank you.
Thank you. Nusrat, I believe you have something to share.
Hi, good morning, everybody. This is Nusrat from Bangladesh Legal Aid and Services Trust, BLAST, and it's based in Bangladesh. And really great to be a part of this today. A lot of good points have come in. And I just wanted to say regarding the hotline numbers we're speaking about. So BLAST, our organization already has a hotline number in place, but one of the problems that we have been facing is that although we are getting calls and everything, it is turning out that in Bangladesh at the moment, like my colleague has also mentioned, other services, for instance, the health and police and judges, they're not, the coordination amongst all of these sectors are not as efficient or effective as it should be in order to treat GBV with the importance that it so requires. So what happens is when we find ourselves in a situation where the referral system is not working as it should be. So although we're getting the calls, at the end of the day, when it's time to sort of like start implementing the referral system, we're facing issues there. So I believe these points have come up from other organizations as well in the chat boxes, if I'm not wrong. And this is definitely a problem that I feel and we feel at BLAST that, it's something to think about how to work out when the referral system in place is not exactly as effective as it should be, or the coordination amongst the within the referral system is not as efficient as it should be.
Thank you, Nusrat. Well, I've just taken that down as a follow-up point to myself and also to understand why it's not functioning, if it's a policy level, if it's a resource problem. So that's really important. Thank you for raising it. On an extremely practical level, unfortunately, this is not as unusual as we'd like, where the referral system is not working properly. Pamela introduced the GBV Pocket Guide resource, and that resource was originally developed for rural parts of Africa, because I noticed some of you also wrote in the chat room about what about rural areas where there are no services. That was developed where services are not functioning 100%. You could still provide basic psychological first aid and be able to talk through what services are available and to be really honest about what services are not available and put choices into the hands of survivors. So it's not ideal, but it is a practical thing to be able to use that resource and really focus on that psychological first aid element and focus on the services that are available. But that's short term, and we do need to make sure that we work very hard to improve and get the multi-sector response back up as soon as possible. Thank you. Are there others who would like to share their experiences? We have let's have some positive news. In Cambodia, the helpline telephone 1280 is free and operational 24/7. And that makes me happy because most of the services that I've been seeing are not open 24/7. So that's a good practice. We might be following up with you to document that service. Thank you for sharing it.
Hi, my name's Mechelle. I work for an organization called Global Alms in Mae Sot in Thailand.
Great.
We run a program called Yes She Matters, and we have a 24/7 hotline, which is 0925980405. I'll put it in the chat. One of the problems that we're having at the moment is there are lots of services available in Thailand, set up through different NGOs that have linked into government services, which are helping. Generally, they are Monday to Friday, 9 to 4. And I mean, the police even have a number that you can call in an emergency, but if you don't speak Thai, then they can't help you. So we're finding that most of our clients, we have some clients that are foreigners and Thai nationals, but the majority of our clients are Burmese migrants. And we're finding that the advocacy part of our program is the real key there. So even though you can report to the police, you can go to the OSCC clinic at the hospital. So it's an arm of the hospital that's specifically for gender-based violence and sexual assault, rape, trafficking. But if you don't have an advocate with you, one, it's really hard to communicate if you don't speak Thai. And two, you kind of get lost in the system. So especially right now with COVID-19, we're finding that our clients are not necessarily a priority, which is understandable because services are overwhelmed right now. But we're finding it a little bit difficult to actually have the police enforce laws, if that makes sense. As you know, domestic violence, especially in Thailand, is not enforced. The law was strengthened somewhat towards mid-2019, but in Mae Sot, it's very difficult to get the police and the courts to actually enforce those new laws. So they're still operating on the old system. So it's taking a lot of push from my team to get action in that area. But especially during COVID-19, there's a real hesitation to do anything because they want everything to stay calm and quiet. There's hesitation there to lock up people to help women who are in distress. So my team, although we do work quite closely with the police, we're finding that clients aren't calling the hotline as much because they don't think the police will actually help them and keep them safe, if that makes sense.
Yes, thank you. I wish I had answers to all of these problems, and I will open the mic for others to respond as well. I mean, three things struck me about that. First, I really appreciate your point that, you know, just having a hotline isn't enough. In order to meet our minimum standards, there needs to be some way to connect that person to services that's safe and is also effective. And the use of advocates, we may need to think about how to do that differently in COVID-19. And that accompaniment is still a service that we may need to highlight as being essential even in the COVID-19 process. So thank you for that. And I think we'll be following up also to ask you, like, what are some practical ways that we can advise GBV services how to continue to use advocacy or accompaniment services. The second is on the advocacy point. Again, this is something in humanitarian context is actually a core function of coordination mechanisms to do joint advocacy. And my question would be, what joint advocacy forums are available to work on this issue? I know Melissa chairs one called Unite Among UN Actors, but is there a way that advocacy with police and government on this issue could be joint and really magnified? Unfortunately, I know from reading that this is not an issue that's only affecting Thailand, but because of closures of courts and downsizing of police staff, this is a global problem. And so we're definitely will take this point to inform global level advocacy as well. Yeah, I think that's the main 2 points that I would like to bring up. And then my third point would be how, if possible, if it's not working, to have the calls going through the GBV specific She Matters hotline. Is it possible to reach out to other hotline providers or even work with the police in terms of general service hotlines that may be able to do referrals? But it definitely sounds like, as you mentioned, the advocacy is key and how to magnify that advocacy. Would any others like to try to answer those concerns or questions?
Lee Ashley, this is Melissa. You can hear me okay?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, great. I'd love to come in on that. And thank you all for all that you're bringing to this conversation. You know, we know that what you're sharing today is happening. We are deeply worried about it, and we are very busy messaging that this is what's happening. And I think that I just want to kind of echo what Lee Ashley has said, that, you know, this is really a pivotal moment, and it could be perhaps even more of a pivotal moment if we can band together and lift these issues for greater visibility. I mean, I think one thing that gives me hope is that even though we know that the situation is bad and that services are in some cases shut down, in some cases just not working fully, or maybe not the quality that we want, we have seen in other emergencies that sometimes, you know, being able to shine a light on these gaps, on these weaknesses, on these, you know, lack of services, or lack of, you know, coordination groups, or lack of protocols, has resulted in there being those things that are missing developed. And so this is really an important moment for civil society to band together and share these concerns and to share these issues with governments. I know you're already doing that. I put into the chat that we also recognize that this is also a moment where we need to really make these issues visible with UN country teams and with interagency task forces that are addressing these issues, that are perhaps trying to address these issues. And we know that in the context of COVID, you know, everyone's focused on survival right now and really trying to limit the spread of this virus, which is, you know, the right thing. However, we also know that you know, what we're in some are calling a shadow epidemic has really already unfolded. And in many country contexts, it's not entirely clear. People think, oh, the problem is not so bad. It's gotten better, and people are enjoying their time at home with each other. But we know that that is absolutely not true for many families, and you've really underlined this. And so we are hopeful that we will see more and more this reality made visible through media articles, through joint statements, through social media. We are looking at a number of ways to identify what issues are being spoken about. I already shared with you that we did a rapid CSO survey at the beginning of the month to understand what are the CSOs seeing and hearing. Do they feel like violence is an issue? Do they feel like services are able to meet the need? And we've been using those findings and really sharing those with a global audience as well as country level audience. And we're using that in our own advocacy with government-led task forces, UN country teams, very high levels of decision making. So we are doing that, but we really would love to know and hear even more from the activists, the allies, the advocates that are doing that. So the more that we can support you in those messages, please let us know. We are active in most of the countries where you're working. We have staff on the ground who are very interested in the very same issues that you're talking about today. So we would very much like to be able to help amplify that. And I think that that's also true for the other, I'm speaking as UN Women, but this is also true for UNFPA, other agencies that are working, OCHA, UNDP, other agencies that are working on these issues, IOM, of course, ILO. So there's a quite an appetite to be taking this knowledge that you're reflecting today and putting that into the hands of decision makers. So the more that you can help us to do that through media, through social media, through direct advocacy. And I think, as I put into the chat, this is a moment to highlight if there is the lack of a national, say, task force on violence against women. And we see that the lack of, what that means right now. There's a poor coordination, referrals not happening, and we're not really talking about the lack of services for violence against women survivors. Then we can push for that. And we can, find ways to support that, So we want to be in a position where we can offer solutions. Government's dealing with a lot of very difficult, issues at the moment. We appreciate that. The more that we can be concrete and clear in our advocacy, the better. So I'll pause there, but I just wanted to really reflect a sense of solidarity and to help convey that we really see this as a shared issue. And that we can do a lot in solidarity and in cooperation together. I know that in Nepal, a number of women's organizations, CSO, women-led organizations, have banded together and they created what they called a charter of demands about how they wanted, women to be part of the decision-making related to COVID. They wanted violence against women to be high on the agenda and services to be considered essential. They wanted issues related to women with disability, migrant women, LGBTI groups to all be getting attention and, in terms of the response, in terms of also prevention. So, efforts such as that, I think, are attention grabbing. And I hope to see more such efforts unfold in other countries. And we look forward to continuing to have this conversation with many of you. So I'll pause there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Melissa. I really took down notes. I mean, the poor coordination means poor services. So this is something as GBVAoR we're very concerned about, and we'll definitely be looking at how we can strengthen coordination, both in the classic humanitarian areas, but also some of the contexts that you've mentioned in the chat box, which may not have dedicated coordination mechanisms. I just want to highlight another interesting emerging practice from Aurora de Dios, that survivors often only have access through texting or phones, and your experience working with religious institutions and congregations have provided more options for shelter, Aurora, would you be able to say more about that? Okay, perhaps we don't have Aurora online. Aurora, just let us know if you want to come online later and discuss that.
Can you hear me now?
Ah, yes, there you are. Please.
Yes, yes. Sorry, I was not opening my speaker. Yeah, this is an organization that's been around for a while. And before, we used to have so much more resources. And our experience in handling survivors of violence has been facilitated by our coordination with first hospitals. A public government-run hospital had, not a desk but an office for our organization. But that too has been abolished because of the needs of the hospital. But it's ideal, I think, to have access to hospitals, because that's where the first place where the survivors would go if they have physical injuries. And then the second is our experience now in downsizing is to really work closely with religious congregations. We're working with Sister Mary John Mananzan, and they have facilities like convents. They have rooms which are ideal for shelters for survivors of violence. And I think this is to facilitate the accessibility of services to survivors, because having just one shelter in a place that's inaccessible is, of course, very difficult for survivors to navigate. So I think the more partnerships we have, ideally with hospitals, secondly with organizations with facilities such as congregations, which almost always have these extra rooms and shelters, and it's part of their advocacy as well. So in situations like the Philippines, where religious congregations, especially run by sisters, are very, very active in addressing violence against women, as well as survivors of violence among migrant women. So I think we need to think of ways to partner also with civic organizations. I'm telling you this because very often survivors do not want to have anything with their anything to do with government services because of some negative perception that they will not be attended to and that they will not be assisted in ways that are respectful. So I think we have to consider those attitudes that, and our data shows that survivors of violence do not approach government agencies when they need help. They're probably more comfortable dealing with NGOs as well as centers run by religious organizations. So that's just a note for us that we shouldn't be limited to only those existing government services. Thank you.
Thank you very much for sharing that, Aurora. That's great. And it responded to several lines of discussion in the chat. People are interested in safe shelters and how we can increase access to that. And thank you also. We all need to be working with civil society organizations to maximize the types and numbers of entry points for GBV survivors to receive services. On the hospitals issue, we mentioned this last week, but if you're having difficulty engaging or convincing health actors that GBV services are essential, the World Health Organization has put out an advocacy sheet on why violence against women services are essential and must be part of the COVID response. So we'll share that again after this webinar. It's a very useful tool if you're on the front lines to advocate with health workers. So if we could just go to the next slide, I have a few wrap-up points and then we can have some more time for question and answer. So I wanted to briefly touch on a few apps or resources. And this will respond to some of the concerns you raised in the discussion. Because we're talking about remote services today, something that's emerging quickly and in other contexts is the use of online safety planning tools. And as you mentioned, survivors may not always feel comfortable approaching government actors, or some of the security services may not be available or accessible or gender sensitive. So I've listed 3 here that you might want to check out. One is just an online form that someone can fill out for themselves. It's a self-assessment. The second one is an interactive online safety planning tool and form. And what's slightly different about this one is this organization, Love is Respect, also has a hotline number and a way to connect survivors to a caseworker if they fill out this interactive tool and want to speak to someone. So it's a really good way of linking that remote service delivery while at the same time allowing a survivor to choose how she would like to do her own safety planning. And then last is just an example of communication material developed by a government that is a booklet on how to do your own safety planning. Now, of course, we know there are risks associated with being online or having a physical booklet in a home that perhaps an abuser may see. So these all should be considered that are urging, and at least in these apps. Safety pin is one that the Asia Foundation supports in the past to be used to assist women identifying safer or unsafe areas. We had COVID feedback, but it is
Ashley, you have been cut off.
Sorry, I lost connection. Now?
A bit better.
To finish off, the other car, which is an application that's run with addressing some of the concerns you raised. So we want to explore what applications are available and what are good at, particularly in thinking about how you deal with confidentiality, consent, and safety issues using these different applications. And we would welcome any feedback on applications that are being used in your context. So with that,
Carly, next slide, yes, okay. So we're sharing the resources via chat, and it will be shared as well by Carly when she sends the recording as well as the presentation deck. Okay. Next slide, please, Carly. So these are the usual go-to sites for our resources. So we have the GBVAoR website. And then if there are specific requests for research, we have GBVAoR help desk, and that is the email address. If you're not yet a member of the GBVAoR community of practice, you can go to gbvaor.net/support to ask to be a member of that community of practice. And this is specifically for GBV technical specialists and coordinators. Okay. Next slide, please. So I think we've reached the end of our webinar session this afternoon. The next session, hopefully Carly or Melissa will focus on migrant workers. Is that correct? I've seen some comments, for instance, from the NGOs working with migrant workers with regards to possibility of having online counseling that can become available in some missions or embassies. So that's something that we can explore perhaps in the next sessions. Okay, next slide, please. So Melissa, do you have other
Yes, I do. Hi. Yes, thank you, Pamela, and thank you both of you for walking us through this really important presentation. I mean, I think all of us can see, based on the conversation that we've had today, that this is a really important moment to be looking at and taking a critical look at what's available, what's not available, and what can we do about services that are not currently available, and how can we raise that collectively for the attention of decision makers. I mean, I think all of you on this call, you're probably seeing the international news right now, which there's a lot of attention on violence against women in the context of COVID. I mean, it's mostly been focusing on domestic violence, and we appreciate that there's many types of violence against women that happen every single day, and that's true today, and it was true 6 months ago. But there's a particular focus on domestic violence or intimate partner violence right now. That's a good thing. The UN Secretary General, about a week ago, issued a statement to countries saying that we have to be addressing violence against women in the context of COVID, and asked governments to sign up and show commitment. And I think 145 governments have signed on this statement of commitment to address violence against women in the context of COVID. And so I think that that's an important opportunity for us to reflect on, okay, how is that coming into play? What are the concrete actions that are being taken? And, you know, as I said before, this is really the moment to say what's happening right now is not meeting the need. We know that it's not meeting the need, and here's why we know it's not meeting the need. But I think that governments need to hear that demand. They need to hear that demand from a variety of angles, from the public, from civil society, absolutely. So I'm really grateful for all of you who are ringing that alarm bell and who are saying, we have a big problem here on our hands, and this problem is not being met. I think the more that we can hear that voice, the more voices we can hear that are saying that on that message, the better the case we can make. So we are making that case. UN agencies are making that case. We're coming together, and we want to be able to do so with a lot of backing from public demand, you know, as well, being able to say that. I also wanted to just reflect on something that was raised by someone named Ellen Sana, who noted that in some of missions and embassies, there are opportunities and there are people who can help others abroad. I think that that's a really important point. Before COVID unfolded, we were starting to do more work with diplomatic embassies around, I mean, just here in Thailand as a start, but also back home in countries, working with foreign affairs to say, you know, let's look at how embassies, how consular officials can be addressing violence against women for their nationals who are abroad. And we see that as a really important opportunity to be able to provide assistance to nationals, any type of national who's abroad. And some countries are starting to step up and say, yes, we want to know more. We want to know how we can address this. And so thank you for that comment. And I think that there's a lot more that we can be doing, and certainly collectively, there's more that we can be doing, work with ministries of foreign affairs to talk about how to provide crisis support to nationals, any kind of national that's abroad. And so we see really important potential there. So I see that we have, I think, about 3 more minutes, and I see that Sumaya Islam would like to come in and say something. So Sumaya, please go ahead.
Yes, thank you. Thank you. You are already mentioned that how the destination country embassy can support. From BNSK, we are closely working with Jordan Embassy, our new ambassador. She's working with our undocumented workers in Jordan who are facing huge problem, women migrant workers. They are getting food support and other support, medical support also. So just I'd like to inform that our destination country, Jordan, is working. And in Malaysia, that is our journey and other organization. And we are trying to mobilize the fund from Ministry of Expatriate Welfare and Foreign Ministry. We're closely working with them because this moment we need government support to channelize. At the same time, civil society organization in this destination country.
Okay, yes, thank you. So thank you for that example, which shows a bit of promise. And yes, just reflecting that we do see this as an important opportunity to engage foreign affairs. When we've engaged foreign affairs, you know, we've done training for, say, 100 foreign service officers before they've deployed. And we found that for them, this was a very new topic. They were not really, this was not part of their usual training. And they became interested in making this part of their regular training. So please do talk to your ministries of foreign affairs to see if this is something you could work together with them around. And, you know, if there were consular officials that were trained to at least provide basic services to their nationals abroad, I think that that would be really a huge advantage. And some governments are already doing quite a lot. We know that here in Thailand, the embassies of the UK, of the United States, and of a few others are very active in that space and have actually been doing training for their own personnel, how to respond. They actually respond quite actively to a lot of cases that involve their own citizens abroad. And our interest is in engaging far more diplomatic missions and embassies on that point. So yeah, I think that's a space we can all be working towards. Before we close, I see that Anju from UN Women in India has put a question around chatbots into the message. And I think that that's an important question, Anju, because we see that there's a few countries that are experimenting with chatbots. Does anyone have a very quick response to that? You can either put it into the chat message, or you could make a quick response. But we recognize that some countries are exploring this. Some have already been doing so. I believe the police in Thailand have been testing a chatbot. And I see that Nusrat would like to make a comment. Nusrat, is that a new hand raised there?
Hi, yeah, that's a new hand raised there. And
okay.
I just wanted to share another thing that we at Bangladesh Legal Aid and Services Trust are doing at the moment. So in relation to advocacy, we're actually in the process of trying to hold and arrange interministerial advocacy sessions online, because given the situation, we understand that it is so important to get the government on board and just get the message across that this is just so serious and this needs to be dealt with and it cannot wait. So as a matter of urgency, we are now resorting to online sessions as well. And thankfully for us, I mean, we've also gotten a lot of cooperation there. So I'm just throwing this idea out there that probably a lot of organizations and countries are already involved in this, but definitely something to consider, how online sessions, advocacy sessions can be of great use right now. Thank you. It's just an idea I wanted to throw out there.
Excellent, excellent. Yes, I think that's important. And there's a number of you online from country groups that can, I know just from watching the chat and seeing the conversations going back and forth, and I know that there's some conversations happening among you. So I think that that's a really good idea, something that needs to be happening at a national level, definitely. And so we very much encourage that. Yes. I mean, I think the idea of banding together, forming communities, solidifying that community, working in solidarity is super important right now on these issues of violence that can really get easily sidelined or might not be getting, full attention right now during COVID. So we are in full support of this kind of solidarity and advocacy in whatever form it can take. So I just note one message here on the chatbot. Lee Ashley noted that she will be following up on the chatbot question, and we'll do our best to get information back to you. We see that that's being explored, as I said, in a couple places, and so we do want to understand and learn from those that have been testing this. We see risks, of course. There's always risks with these online support services. We always have to think about safety, confidentiality, and privacy, because women are often not having privacy or confidentiality or being safe at home, and there is risk with them accessing services. So, please do access the tech support resources online. There's very good technology guidance online related to providing remote and online services for violence against women right now during COVID, and anytime we're providing those remote services. So we really encourage everyone to read those guidance notes that draw from practice. So I want to thank you all for your comments, your questions. They're really giving us more and more to think about. We are planning another session in another week, which we'll be sending out an announcement to you. There's two that are forthcoming. One that's on the overall Interagency Standing Committee, which is a humanitarian group that helps set standards and policies and guidance. We will be having a session on the IASC guidelines on GBV and emergencies and how that operates and what we can draw from that as development actors. And we'll also be doing one, as Lee Ashley noted, on migrants and how we can be supporting and linking up the different service providers that focus on migrant women and migrants in general with those that focus on violence against women. And that's something that we've been doing in our joint program with UN Women and ILO called Safe and Fair in the ASEAN region. We've been putting a lot of attention on how do we link together services, service providers, knowledge, tools, everything on violence against women and violence against women migrant workers. So we will be happy to share more information about that as we move forward. So I'm going to move to close this session because I want to be respectful of everyone's time. You've given us a lot of time, and we're so happy to see such a large group participating in this event. I want to say to Lee Ashley and Pamela, really thank you so much for bringing us your time, your expertise, your knowledge. We're so grateful for that and all the time you took to prepare for this session. And we know that everyone's a bit weary with webinars, but really thank you to all of you for taking time to participate in this session. Lee Ashley and Pamela, any closing words before we close off the session?
But just very briefly, as from GBVAoR Asia and the Pacific, we're grateful for this opportunity to support agencies as they transition from development work to humanitarian, specifically the COVID-19 response. And we're really excited to bridge development actors with humanitarian architecture and actors. So thank you again for this platform and opportunity.
Yes, I'll just echo the same and say thank you. And we hope to see you again next week.
Okay, yes, please do join us next week. We have another opportunity to talk more next Tuesday, same time, and you can reach us in the same way. Thank you, everyone. Wishing you all safety, health, and well-being. Please take care of yourselves, and we look forward to next time. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Have a good day.
You too. Bye-bye.
Have a good day, everyone. Stay
Bye-bye.
safe. Bye.
You too. Bye.
Bye-bye.